Hello, BookTube. I come to you today with yet another installment of the Cromwellathon for the month of January. Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse is hosting a read-along of Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. We'll be going on to Bring Up the Bodies, and then that third one, which I never write down, and I can never remember its name, and it hasn't actually been released yet, but I'll get to that. So yes, we're going through Wolf Hall, so heavy spoilers. You're probably only watching this if you're actually reading the novel and are just dying to hear what I have to say. In this installment, we are talking about Part 4, 2, and 3, and Part 5, 1. It's been kind of a crappy reading week for me, but just my own crap. But I put on that burst at the end, and actually ended up having a really good reading week. I really enjoyed this section of Wolf Hall. It really clicked with me. Yes. I also because I don't know, just because I'm a glutton for stuff. I watched The Other Boleyn Girl, the adaptation of Philippa Gregory's The Other Boleyn Girl, her 2001 novel, which got turned into a 2008 movie, whereas the cover of this one says, two sisters competing for the greatest prize, the love of a king. And indeed, in The Other Boleyn Girl, you have the hunky, if maybe not that projecty kind of strong of a figure of Eric Bana, hunky Aaron Bana, looks amazing with his shirt off. And the two sisters, to be fair to actually, from what I've read about the book and what the movie portrays, they actually do kind of get into the whole thing of, well, Henry's actually discarding his old wife and looking for a new one. It's not just sort of like, I need to have a boy because I'm a man, but also because I am a king, and that if as a king you do not produce an heir, especially in England, which has been riven with a lot of civil war, it would be the greatest invitation to civil war happening. And indeed, when we get into Wolf Hall today, the same point is made, that an heir will guarantee that there's not the chance of civil war. So while there's a lot of me that really kind of tends to look down on Henry VIII, this movie, actually, I'll give it that, did remind me, it's like, well, this is not just the king as a person, this is king as the state. Other than that, it was a sumptuously acted, as well as Eric Bana. You have, as Anne Boleyn, you have Natalie Portman doing her intense Natalie Portman. You have Scarlett Johansson doing a little bit more kind of a doughy-eyed innocent, which from readers of Wolf Hall, you'll be thinking Mary Boleyn as a doughy-eyed innocent. Yeah. And who's that? Mark Rylance, who, if you are keeping up with the adaptation games, he plays Thomas Cromwell in the BBC adaptation of Wolf Hall. In this, he is playing a Thomas, but Thomas Boleyn, the father to Anne and Mary, have to pimp out their daughters to gain influence with the king, and at least it is kind of presented up front that way. It then turns into this romance. To be honest about it, it should have been more trashy. They actually kind of tried to class up the joint, which I think was a mistake. It was kind of paced in a slow manner. They tried to kind of keep it classy, whereas I think they should have just gone, they should have gone full on, more kind of Claudius, just horrible, gross disgustingness. And it sounds like Philippa Gregory did sort of the same thing in her book, but in the movie they kind of pull back from that a bit. This is not a book or movie where they're particularly respecting historical accuracy. I guess they're going with the romance, and indeed, this is a book that it seems to be The Other Boleyn Girl is in the romance field. So good on him for doing that, and apparently he was massively popular. I'd be curious. We have all these awards and laudits for Hilary Mantel for her Thomas Cromwell series, but I wonder if probably Philippa Gregory is laughing all the way to the bank on that one. Okay, so that was a little way to sort of cheer myself up. Let's get into Wolf Hall rather than the other Boleyn girl. In these sections, I think we get to see the flip. Thomas Cromwell up to this point has been the powerless one, the one who's had to kind of scramble and kind of maybe hold himself in. There has been comments of like how basically I've been controlling my temper. I've not been getting angry. I have not been getting, it's like he's been playing the game, but he's been playing the game at the disadvantage. This is most notably shown with his interactions with Thomas More. At the beginning of these sections, indeed, we have Thomas More threatening him again. But fairly quickly after that, Thomas More falls, and the first thing that happens is they ask More, what do you plan to do? And he says, I plan to write and pray. And Cromwell's response is, well, I suggest you write very little and pray a lot. And Moore's like, is that a threat? He says, yes, I believe that is. And it's like, you get that. There's that kind of kick of, it's the underdog is finally top dog. That starts to kind of get a little bit darker as we go along. It's interesting here. We get the whole thing of Thomas Cromwell and his memory. And it's like, Thomas Cromwell has a very good memory. He says at the very, very end sections, I have a large ledger with it, under name and under offense, the details of the people who have cut across me. It's like he's been taking names all this time, and you get this sense of this kind of build, like he's going to get ready to party. He's going to get ready to start striking down people. There's very, very much, there's a couple of things here where it's like, you shouldn't have threatened me. He says that to a fellow at a wedding. It's like, don't you mess with my family. And Cromwell kind of goes back and says, you should have never threatened me. It's like, you're on the list, buddy. And indeed, he's adding people to the list at that wedding party. We have scenes of, Mr. So-and-so there. He's got a bit of a downturned face. He's on the list. It's like, okay. Mantel's definitely is kind of going into the darker side of Thomas Cromwell. Not that she's been hiding the dark side of Thomas Cromwell. Indeed, I was thinking about the structure of this book. I think that some people had expressed kind of disappointment at that we skip over so much of his early days at the beginning of the novel. And I actually chalked that up to the idea of like, well, we don't really know much about his early biography, so Mantel just kind of quickly skipped over it. But as we've gone along, we keep on getting these little flashbacks because of all the stuff that Thomas Cromwell remembers and Thomas Cromwell is holding next to him. And indeed, in the early scene where Thomas More threatens him, he flashes back to a day where he ran away from Walter, who was like really pissed off and was going to beat him. He runs away and he ends up witnessing the burning of an old woman, an heretic, who believes that the Eucharist is just bread. Purgatory is made up. It's not in the Gospels. All this stuff. And they burn him, and he gets adopted by a woman in the crowd and gets made to watch this. Gets to watch this woman be burned for her beliefs. Put in there with his own the reign of terror that is happening with him at home with Walter, and at the end of that, he meets the friends or the kind of the fellow evangelicals. I'm referring to them as evangelicals because Protestants wouldn't actually be what you'd call them at the time. They are the ones who are bringing the gospel to England. We have had 800 years of mysticism, and now the truth, the gospel, is getting brought into England, and revealing all the kind of the nonsense and lies that have been told to us by the Roman Church. And it's like there's a real, I love that connection. This actually, I think, is a part of where I went with, this is Thomas Cromwell right there, watching this poor old woman get burned, having fled from his own terror at home. It's like, that is actually, I'm starting to kind of feel like, I'm starting to feel Thomas Cromwell there. It's interesting. It's like, as that kind of, that darkness, the stuff that is held deep into him, and he says, like, it's weird. This scene, this memory is burned into him. He can't remember why he ran away from home that day. He can't remember how he got home again afterwards, but it's just that scene is there in his mind. So it's the whole thing of Thomas Cromwell and his memory or his ledger. It's interesting that he does use the word ledger. I mean, he is very much an accounts kind of guy. He can be very dry that way, but there's also a thing of it's a ledger and I'm going to pay you back. Oh yes, I am going to pay you back, which is, it's engaging. There's a psychology there that I can really get into. This is Cromwell thinking to himself, and I think this sums up the reason of this book. A man's power is in the half-light, in the half-seen movements of his hand and the unguessed-at expression of his face. It is the absence of facts that frightens people, the gap you open, into which they pour their fears, fantasies, desires, which is the genius, dare I say, of someone like Hilary Mantel, of picking a great unknowable, someone who seems to arouse passions very strong on both sides, and say, that is the figure I'm going to base a trio of books on. A Cromwell where, to me, the big excitement in this book is that he comes back from the wedding and you can tell he's been pissed off. That guy threatened him, and you shouldn't have tried to threaten me. And he sits down to write the Act of Restraint of Appeals. That is never actually mentioned as a thing, but what he writes down there is text from the Restraint of Appeals, which is basically the starting of the transferring of power from the English part of the Catholic Church to the king. The power, the wealth, will give Henry the power to have his marriage annulled. But will also allow Henry to get a lot of wealth. And Cromwell smartly says, like, well, this isn't going to be a popular thing. People are super invested in the church. They are super invested in the in the power of prayer that these churches, that these monks, that the friars are doing for the people. This was seen as the main economy. I mean, this is pre-Protestant England. Like, the thought that they would actually take away the church's land, that they would knock down all these churches, all these monasteries, was not something that was going to fly with the public. But Cromwell very cunningly uses the Parliament as a means of justification for that. And it's interesting. This is something that it's really below the surface. Mantel, as I said, never kind of highlights this, doesn't name it. I mean, I don't know if it was actually called the Act of Restraint of Appeals at the time. I would have to look that up. But it's there. It's there in the background. Indeed, if this probably got adapted to the BBC, I'd be surprised maybe if some of this political stuff was there. But like, this is the stuff that Cromwell did. Like, the reason why the marriage happens to Anne Boleyn is because he gets the act through, and now it's like there's no appealing to the Pope anymore to block Henry. Henry is the last. Henry, who controls the bishops, can annul his own marriage in effect. So it's interesting. Even in a book like this, it's much more. It is much more about, obviously it's going to be much more about those human relations, even if it isn't romance. It's still buried there a little bit under the surface, which I thought was interesting, which is probably why I'm reading history books, because I'm such a policy wonk, I guess. Ooh. Sort of a policy wonk. It's like, these are all the structural, fundamental things that came out of this. It's a guy married, got, annulled a marriage to his first wife and got married to his second wife. Whoop-de-doo. However, he fundamentally changed religion, and the Parliament suddenly became much more of a thing, arguably, in the English system, which England and the Parliament, it's a big thing. It's a big thing, and it's had huge effects on how how world history has gone along. And indeed, all those colonist Protestants coming to North America and colonizing the continent and becoming basically de facto a Protestant USA, Protestant Canada, where Catholics were beat upon in North America due to something that happened with Henry VIII back in the 1500s. It's huge. It's huge. I guess it's why even over here in North America we're very fascinated with this time, and it can sometimes get lost in the romance. Even though I again I have to say, give credit to Philippa Gregory that there's the concerns of having an heir to prevent civil war. I mean, which sometimes even I got lost on in there. So we've got Cromwell in his crimson robes, very much feeling like, wow, I've now eclipsed the master, Cardinal Wolsey. And in crimson robes, which I'm trying to remember, but crimson robes to me seems very much they've dressed him up as the cardinal, even though obviously he's not a cardinal. Though of course we also get crimson. I think of blood, and oh, will the blood flow? Being a ghoulish glutton for all the horrors that happened in history, it's rather ghoulish, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so I enjoyed myself this week. I feel like I plugged in a little bit more to the personal psychology of this Cromwell. It's an interesting theory on this Cromwell. I think there's a thing of this guy who, all the people around him, all the nobles, the ambassador from the Emperor Chapui, they never let him forget, we know where you came from. And indeed, when Chapui says, oh, be shame if anything happened to that Anne, and Cromwell grabs him, he's like, oh, of course, you resort to kind of physical violence. It shows how they say you're breeding, which is a lovely thing of, it's like you're a low class nothing, but also, your father was a violent bastard as well. So there's a nice double hit in there. I do think the class thing probably has shaped a lot of ways of how history has viewed Thomas Cromwell. A lot of the people who are writing the histories aren't going to be people, even on either side of the fence, of the Catholic or the Protestant, aren't going to particularly look upon this money low class guy particularly as someone that they're going to stick up for, or they're going to ascribe lovely sentiments to. There's a thing of when he sits down to write the Act of Appeals, he's like, okay, he takes off the rings. He takes off the ring from both the cardinal and also the one that Henry gave, the gem that the King of France attempted to bribe him with. He put it in a ring and gave that to him. He takes them both off and he sits down to write the acts of restraint of appeal. And he's, it's like, talks about his own unconcealable fist unmasked by velvet. It's like, yes, Cromwell is going to do brutal, ruthless stuff, but unlike Henry VIII, who gets played by hunky Eric Bana, he is not going to get concealed by the romance, the noblesse oblige of I'm not using that right, but that kind of the cloak of royalty, the cloak of nobility. It's like, no, you are a lower class nothing, and anything you do, we see it, and you can't hide that. There is, of course, also the iron fist and the velvet glove, so that that is an iron fist that Cromwell is wielding, but it is not going to be cloaked in the velvet, because he doesn't come from that. He is a useful tool to the king, and indeed, a lot of what he does can get blamed on, it's Cromwell. He's the devil. Poor king. It's like, whoa. the king who keeps Mary, so who nixes Mary Boleyn's marriage at the moment because, well, I can't have sex with Anne Boleyn at the moment, so I'm keeping Mary Boleyn around to be my concubine. And it's like, Cromwell apologizes to her for that. It's like, how much did you argue? It's like, well, he didn't argue much because he's there to please the king. Another thing of just exactly how well, implicated he is in this system. As I do, he is the hero of his own story, but I think Mantel, I give it to Mantel. I think she's good at showing exactly how implicated he is in this deeply hypocritical, ruthless, base system, which is the only system there is. And I'd be probably talking about our own political system now if I wasn't talking about that. There's this whole thing of power. It's like Cromwell with no power and then Cromwell with power. And you see, it's like, okay, we've been hiding, like all that memory is now coming. I've been keeping names. So can't wait for the rest of this. We've got one more chunk to read in Wolf Hall, and then it'll be on to Bring Up the Bodies. Bring Up the Bodies. Its title is sounding more and more ominous as I go along. I have not read that one yet. So, all right. I'll blabber to you later more about Cromwell and Wolf Hall and all that. Bye for now.